is so good to be here with you all. I want to thank Governor Bush and Brandy and Patricia and everyone for inviting me back, and all of you for being here, which is awesome. I woke up this morning and watched the sunrise over the Magic Kingdom from my window, which was surreal because it sort of backlit all these strange structures that exist in Orlando. There was like a 17-story tall pelican, I believe, for some reason. And it was kind of glorious. And I was thinking, wow, look at what Americans are capable of. And then at that exact moment, I swear to you, in the parking lot below, two people started screaming at each other. And I was like, there you go. That's the whole catastrophe right there. We often get in our own way as humans. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how we get in our own way and how we get out of our own way. I want to start by telling a story. And it's a story that takes place in San Francisco before there was Silicon Valley, before there was Facebook, long before Mark Zuckerberg. There was Charles Crocker. Charles Crocker was a railroad baron, and he looked the part. He was 300 pounds, 6 feet tall, quite intimidating. And in the 1870s, he decided that he and his family needed a proper mansion, as one does. And so he began scouting the city, looking for the perfect scenic vista. And he found a stretch of land that would become Nob Hill and began buying up all the little houses and cottages on this block. And there was one gentleman who refused to sell. Nicholas Young was a German immigrant who lived in a little cottage with his family and had a garden that he loved. And he wasn't going to go easily. So the two men sat down to negotiate. And Charles Crocker offered $6,000 for the land. And Nicholas Young countered at $12,000, an aggressive counteroffer. And Charles Crocker offered $9,000, met him in the middle, thinking it was very generous of him. Nicholas Young refused to budge, staying at $12,000. Things escalated. Eventually, Charles Crocker started yelling profanities and stormed out of the room. And now it became about more than the $3,000 difference, right? It became about respect and power and belonging, which is usually where you get into trouble in conflict. So at this point, Charles Crocker decided to carry on, plow on, and his builders began raising everything that was on the block. Nicholas Young would not budge. Charles Crocker would not budge. So he used the $3,000 to build a 40-foot tall fence around Charles Crocker's property. And he built his 12,000 square foot proper mansion. You can see it there. In case you can't see the fence, I've colored it in for you. This is what is known as a spite fence. Has anyone ever heard of a spite fence? Sometimes, I don't know about you, but it can feel like we are just building spite fence after spite fence after spite fence in this country right now. So what happened? Well, neither men would budge. So they lived this way for years. Eventually, Nicholas Young died. His widow moved out, but again would not sell. The vacant property began to fill with trash. His garden died, of course, because the fence had blotted out the sun long ago. And then Charles Crocker died. And then eventually, 28 years after the spite fence was built, the children came to an agreement and took it down. 1 year later, there was an earthquake and a fire that destroyed everything. Because God has a sense of humor, I guess. So this is the kind of conflict that I want to talk to you about today. It is high conflict, which is a conflict that begins to have a life of its own. It stops being about the thing that it started being about, right? It's not about the $3,000 anymore. And it starts to become conflict for conflict's sake. Our brains literally operate differently in high conflict, and we make a lot of mistakes. Eventually, almost everyone ends up worse off. And the phrase high conflict comes from high conflict divorces. About a quarter of American divorces could be characterized as high conflict, meaning they are stuck in perpetual cycles of hostility and blame. In high conflict divorces, who suffers the most? The children. And it is also true in high conflict politics, and in high conflict neighborhoods, and in high conflict workplaces. That is always who is going to ultimately suffer the most. So this was a high conflict. It took on a life of its own. How many people in this room right now have stopped talking to someone about politics because of something they said? Anyone? Governor Bush is like, right here. Okay, so almost half the country says they have stopped talking to someone about politics because of something they said. Does anyone here have political views they're afraid to share in certain contexts? Anyone? Okay. 62%, almost 2/3 of Americans have political views they're afraid to share. Now, isn't this interesting, right? Because it seems like people just can't stop sharing their political opinions, right? But 2/3 of people have gone silent, which is actually just as dangerous for different reasons. So this is one of the paradoxes of high conflict, is that the extremes get louder and everybody else flees the scene. Because who wants to be part of that? Understandably. Right now, 54% of Americans see each other as the biggest threat facing the United States. More than any other threat they've been polled about, including economic forces, natural disasters like viruses, and foreign threats like Russia or China. This is an incredible statistic. I think we can all agree. And I always wonder what percentage of that is correct and what percentage of that is fabricated and what percentage of that is misunderstanding and disinformation. I don't know, but that would be great to know. I also wonder who is benefiting. Who does that serve? I got obsessed with this, with trying to understand conflict about 5 years ago because it felt like my profession of journalism was broken. It just seemed like it wasn't functioning the way I had always thought it was supposed to function. And anything I might do was either going to make the conflict worse or have no effect at all. So I stopped what I was doing and started hanging out with people who understand conflict intimately and differently than journalists. All kinds of people, including people who have themselves been stuck in conflict, in high conflict, and aren't anymore. Because I wanted to see, obviously, how did you do that? And how could the rest of us learn from what you did? So there were a lot of places that I went and people that I met. I want to share just one thing with you before I introduce you to some of those people. There's a place at Columbia University called the Difficult Conversations Lab, which, first of all, is like the best name ever. And it's run by a professor named Peter Coleman. And they have studied more than 500 strained, tense, conflict conversations all over the world between people who disagree profoundly on big controversial issues like guns, abortion, Israel, all kinds of things. And what they found is that you can sort these conversations into roughly 2 buckets. And some of them, when you do the dial test of people's emotions during the conversation, look like this in the data. So people are stuck in the same emotions over and over, usually anger and frustration, mostly negative, right? As you might expect. But some of them look like this, which is people experience anger and frustration, as they should. But they have a whole galaxy of emotions. So they experience anger and frustration, and then flashes of curiosity and understanding and humor and confusion, and then back to anger and frustration. They ask more questions, and they leave the lab more satisfied. This is good conflict. I like to call it that in homage to what the late John Lewis used to call good trouble. You need conflict. This country needs good conflict. You cannot have a country that is this diverse and sprawling and complicated without conflict. We need to push each other and to be pushed, to challenge each other. Conflict is the best shortcut to transformation. but it needs to be good conflict. That is probably the most important thing I've learned, which is the problem isn't conflict. It's high conflict. So what causes high conflict, and how do you get out of its trap? Because it literally is a trap. It is very hard to resist once it gets going. Some of the people that I followed include Gary Friedman, who was a conflict expert who helped 2,000 people and companies through all kinds of ugly disputes as a mediator, labor management disputes, ugly divorces. He's written books on conflict. He teaches negotiation at Stanford and Harvard, knows everything there is to know about conflict. And then a few years ago, he ran for office in his tiny town in Northern California. And as he puts it, it took him about 1/8 of a second before he got sucked into high conflict himself. Because politics, even now at the local level, is designed to create high conflict for reasons we'll talk about. And no one is immune, not even Gary, much to his dismay. So he lost 2 years of his peace of mind and his life, as he puts it, to this high conflict, which to an outsider seemed absurd. Like these disputes seemed so small. But just like with the spite fence, it's really not about the money or the water rate or whatever the disputes, or in this case, there was a bus stop feud about the new bus stop. It's really not about that. And Gary knew that in high conflict, you have to dig underneath that. What is it really about? Every high conflict has the thing we talk about endlessly and the thing it's really about. But it took him a while to remember this and to be able to excavate himself out of high conflict, which he did, to his great credit. This is Curtis Toller. Curtis Toller joined his first gang at age 9 on the south side of Chicago because he wanted to belong, which is what all of us want. And by the way, drives most conflict that you're seeing, in my opinion. The fear of not belonging, the desire to belong. He grew up idolizing a Chicago basketball star, high school basketball star named Benji Wilson. And when one day Benji Wilson was shot and killed out of nowhere on his lunch break from high school, Curtis became convinced that it was because of a rival gang. And he spent literally decades locked in a vendetta with the gangster disciples. He rose through the ranks of his own gang, which was the Black Keystone Nation, becoming a leader at a time in his life when he most needed to be led. Many, many things happened, which we don't have time to get into here, but eventually, Curtis met Billy Moore, who was the man who had shot his high school basketball hero. And for a variety of reasons, including that it was 20 years later after Billy had gotten out of prison, and including the fact that they met at Friday services at a mosque, they were both Muslim by this point, Curtis could listen to what Billy told him about what had really happened that day. And in that moment, Curtis realized that the story he had been telling himself about this conflict his whole life was not true, which is what usually happens in high conflict. And it's a startling, disorienting revelation. Many other things happened, but Curtis eventually joined Arne Duncan in creating Chicago Cred, and now he helps many, many dozens of men out of high conflict and helps them do it much faster than he was able to do it. This is Sandra Milena Bustos, who grew up in Colombia and, like Curtis, was looking to belong, looking for protection, ended up joining the FARC, which is the largest guerrilla force in Colombia with communist roots, and like everyone in high conflict, found herself over time imitating the behavior of her adversaries, doing the things, harming the things that she had gotten into the fight to protect. Many things happened again, but like Gary and like Curtis, it was Sandra's family who helped pull her out of high conflict. She reached a saturation point, like Gary and like Curtis, where the losses of the conflict seemed too great to bear. And luckily, she had the support of a family who welcomed her home, which turns out to be critical to anyone trying to leave high conflict. In fact, the most effective public service announcements that have been tried in Colombia, and many, many have been tried to get people out of conflict, are the ones that ran during soccer games featuring Colombia's national team and simply invited FARC members to come home and watch the next game with their parents, with their family. Lots of reasons why that worked and other things didn't work, but I think that the common thread is to light up people's other identities, particularly as parents or children. We all carry many identities around with us, don't we? Right? Like, does anyone remember the big board at Penn Station in New York City? The trains would change the schedules and it'd go, you remember that? Yeah. And I always think of that with identities. We all carry around these identities, and a lot of them are in conflict with each other. But it's leaders who can help light up those latent identities just outside of the conflict. So just to summarize the difference here that I'm trying to articulate between good conflict and high conflict, because once you see it, not just in the data, but once you feel it in yourself, it's pretty easy, I think, to recognize. And one of the differences is anger is okay in both places. Contempt is much harder to work with. There's a lab in Israel that studies emotions in conflict, and they have found that contempt is the hardest emotion. Because anger assumes you want the other person or the other side to be better, right? When I'm yelling at my husband, I want him to be better, and vice versa. Contempt is another thing altogether. Contempt, you've given up on this person ever being better. Same problem with disgust. Some other differences, there can be surprise in good conflict. In high conflict, there's very little surprise. I don't know about you, but I take out my phone some mornings and I scroll through the headlines, and I feel like I don't need to read the stories because I know what they're going to say. That's high conflict. In good conflict, there is movement, right? Remember that slide with all the different emotions? In high conflict, there is rigidity. In good conflict, there is complexity, which is what real life and real humans are. And high conflict, everything gets very clear, very simple. Too simple. In good conflict, there is curiosity, right? A sense of wonder, occasional flashes of awe. In high conflict, there is certainty and righteousness. In good conflict, there is passion. There can be movements and protests and marches. All of that is great. In high conflict, there is righteousness and arrogance. In good conflict, this is the most important thing, in case it's not obvious, violence is unlikely. In high conflict, violence is very likely. All over the world, whether it's in divorces or neighborhoods or politics, these patterns hold. So I want to end this talk before Stephanie comes to join me to talk a little bit about a story of a place, not just a person, but an entire place that shifted out of high conflict into good conflict. Because that is the whole trick, right? Not no conflict, but good conflict. And I'll tell you the most interesting diabolical secret that I have learned about high conflict, which is any intuitive thing you do in high conflict will probably make the conflict worse. You cannot trust your instincts in high conflict. I am reminded of this over and over and over again, to the point where I now routinely, automatically resist my first instinct, and sometimes my second and third in high conflict. And I think you'll see that here in this story. So B'nai Jeshurun is a synagogue on the Upper West Side of New York City. Has anyone ever been there or heard of this place? Okay. And it is a place that was started in the 1800s by German and Polish immigrants, and it became one of the most influential synagogues in the world, home to about 2,400 New York families, and a place that is renowned for its singing and dancing at Friday night services. A few years ago, B'nai Jeshurun fell into high conflict all of a sudden, it appeared. The kind of conflict that almost made it come undone after 200 years of existence. It all started with an email. The rabbis, who tended to lean left on Israel, sent an email to the congregation, as they often did. In this particular email, they celebrated a recent United Nations vote upgrading Palestine's status. This email set off a chain reaction. Many conservative members in the congregation felt that this was a dangerous affront to Israel's security. They felt like it was an embarrassment. They felt like it was a threat. The conflict spilled out into public, landing on the front page of the New York Times. People left the synagogue who had been members for generations. People withheld their donations. It was, for everyone involved, a very painful time. This is Rabbi Roli, who had been rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun for 30 years at this point. And he is, in most rooms, a very gentle presence. He has the lilting accent of his home in Argentina. He loves the Arabic lute, which he plays. He is the one who made music and dancing so special at B'nai Jeshurun. And what he told me was, it felt like an earthquake. All the hostility out of nowhere. People I loved and respected and thought loved and respected me were saying terrible things in public about me. By the way, these are the same words that many people in other high conflicts have said to me. It felt like an earthquake. People I loved were saying terrible things. It's extremely painful for humans to feel ostracism from their group, whatever that group is. It is evolutionarily quite dangerous. And researchers call it social pain because our brain processes it the same way we process physical pain. The only difference is it's much easier for us to recall than physical pain. So we can keep inflaming it in our own minds over and over and over. In Roli's case, he had a few choices. He did what most of us do, let's be honest. When we feel rejection out of nowhere from our own group, what do you think he did? He apologized and hoped it would go away. A year later, the conflict flared up again. This time about a letter with the mayor. It's a whole thing. I don't want to bore you, but the point is, the facts really didn't matter anymore. And this time it landed in the Washington Post. More people left. More people withheld their donations. Rabbi Roli and others were in a great deal of turmoil. He thought he had three choices, which is one, he could leave and find a synagogue that was more aligned with his own views on Israel, which wouldn't be that hard to do. Two, he could keep fighting the way he was fighting and people would leave one by one. Three, any thoughts? He could keep his mouth shut about Israel, which is, by the way, what half of American rabbis say they do. Right? Very tempting. The problem is this kind of conflict doesn't go away. It goes underground, where it gets stronger and causes more problems eventually, right? None of those options felt right to Rabbi Roli. He had always thought that he needed to have disagreement in his congregation, that it was part of his job as a spiritual leader to push his congregants and to be pushed. The controversy is how you got stronger, or it always had been, but suddenly it seemed like it was going to burn down the whole house. So, with the urging of his congregants, a few of his congregants, Rabbi Roli took a fourth option, less traveled, which is he decided to lean into the conflict. He brought in mediators who had worked in the Middle East from an organization called Resetting the Table, and they spent an entire year changing the entire culture at the synagogue for how they deal with conflict. They had 25 meetings with each other about the conflict. They had listening sessions. They went to each other's homes and told stories about Israel, what their parents had told them they could and could not say about Israel. They had all kinds of listening sessions, of deep listening training. It sounds kind of kumbaya, but it was much more like training for an Ironman competition. Like, it was super grueling, and there were many, many days when Rabbi Roli wanted to quit. But it was important that they did this. And I think to understand why, it's important to understand the triggers of high conflict, the fire starters. And we'll just mention a few that were present here and why things got out of hand, which makes sense, helps us understand how you unwind it. The first one was that there was the presence of a false binary. This is true in almost every high conflict I've ever seen, which is the world gets neatly divided into two camps, in this case, pro-Israel and anti-Israel. In fact, it's madness because everyone thought they were pro-Israel, right? In fact, there's a lot of internal dissonance around Israel for most American Jews, and a lot of complexity depending on how you ask the question. So it was a false binary. In case it isn't obvious, this is something we have going on in American politics. And this is one of the reasons we are more polarized than almost any other country, because we have a two-party winner-take-all system, and humans don't behave well in a binary system like that. It brings out sort of our worst conflict instincts. Putting that aside, back to the story, another thing that was present that led to a high conflict in this case is humiliation, which I actually think is the most underappreciated, interesting, and dangerous force driving all kinds of high conflict. Gang violence, domestic violence, diplomatic standoffs. If you look closely enough, humiliation is present. The psychologist Evelyn Lindner calls humiliation the nuclear bomb of the emotions. Nelson Mandela once told Oprah, he said, "There is no one more dangerous than one who has been humiliated, even if you humiliate him rightly." I love that last part of that quote. It is the kind of thing that leads to extreme social pain that we were talking about earlier. And it is the kind of thing that will supercharge the conflict. In this case, why was it humiliating? Well, it was humiliating because it was public, because it was in the newspaper, right? For everyone involved, that is humiliating. As any classroom teacher knows, how many current or former classroom teachers? Okay, so you know if there's an audience for a conflict with a teenager, you got yourself a problem, right? You want to remove that teenager from the audience if possible. So the same is true with adults. Anytime there's an audience on social media or in the news media, there's an opportunity for humiliation. But this is tricky, right? Because what might humiliate me might not humiliate you. It's an emotion, and it's subjective, and it's influenced by thoughts, right? Just a quick, silly example. During the pandemic, I played golf for the first time in my life because there was nothing else to do, honestly. And it was my husband and my son, who was 14, and my son was super into driving the golf cart, and I was like, this is fine, it's beautiful, you know, whatever. And of course, many times, not once, many times I took a swing, gave it my best shot, totally missed the ball, of course. Did I feel humiliated? No, this was absurd. I had no identity caught up in this at all. Like, this is just the whole thing was just hilarious to me. But my husband had played golf for many years before we had kids. And if he had missed the ball, it would have meant something very different, right? Conversely, I played soccer my whole life. If I were to take a big old swing and totally miss the ball, that would not feel good, right? So humiliation is subjective, which leads to our third fire starter, because humiliation can be manipulated by conflict entrepreneurs. Conflict entrepreneurs are people and companies that exploit and inflame conflict for their own ends. They frame everything as a humiliation. Every divorce attorney has a story about this. If there's a high conflict divorce, there's usually someone on the outside, sister, friend, neighbor, who's whispering in the husband or wife's ear, inflaming the conflict, describing everything as a humiliation. Usually, this is for their own ends. Sometimes it's obvious, it's for profit. More often, I find it's for power, for a sense of belonging, again, for attention. And right now, we've set up a bunch of institutions, news media, social media, other things, to reward and incentivize and cultivate conflict entrepreneurs. But I will tell you, everyone I've ever met who's shifted out of high conflict has started by distancing themselves from the conflict entrepreneurs in their lives or on their social media feed. So it turns out to be a really important thing to try to identify who here is acting as a conflict entrepreneur and to try not to be one yourself, right? Because it is tempting, it is. In this case, the conflict entrepreneurs were some of the opinion columnists outside of the congregation who sort of delighted in watching the downfall of this storied synagogue, and also people within the congregation who, for their own needs and desires, were inflaming the conflict, using grandiose language to describe it, embellishing the evil of the other side, that kind of thing. So when they decided to lean into the conflict, what they were trying to do is get some space from these fire starters, right? Because the presence of all three at once is where you get into trouble. You can kind of manage one or the other, but all three binary groups, humiliation, conflict entrepreneurs, can be really hard to manage. So the first thing they did, as I mentioned, is they listened to each other. This is the first thing to do in any high conflict, and it's not natural. It is not your first impulse, right? And it's certainly not something most of us know how to do well. When I started out on this path, I took active listening training, and I rolled my eyes because I thought, I know how to do this. I've been interviewing people for 20 years. How hard could it be? Within about 15 minutes, I realized I was not very good at it. I now have trained hundreds of journalists in this. Same thing. They're all kind of like cynical and sarcastic, and within 15 minutes, they realize they don't know how to do this. Because real listening means listening in ways people can see. It's not just, furrowing your brow and laughing at the right moments and looking like you're listening. It's actually proving you're listening by articulating what the other person has said in the most elegant language you can muster and playing it back for them, not parroting it back. In your own language, trying to get at what seems most important to them, not to you. That's a hard one for the journalists I train. What seems most important to them, and checking to see if you got it right. So this is something they did in the synagogue. They also surveyed all the members. They found that about half had been keeping their views on Israel to themselves, which turned out to be a mistake and a loss for everyone. Eventually, something started to shift, and people realized that there weren't two camps, right? There weren't two camps. There were many different, maybe 7, 8, maybe 75 different camps when it came to Israel. And nobody fit neatly into one box or another. I remember Irv Rosenthal, one of the members, telling me that, who was to the left on Israel usually, he said to me that this one fellow member had told him that, she was raised to think that because her ancestors had died in the Holocaust, any criticism of Israel was sacrilegious. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, that kind of thing. And he still profoundly disagrees with her. But now he understands that, and he can speak her language as he disagrees, if that makes sense. So it opened up a whole range of possibilities for him and for her, which is usually what happens. We lose our peripheral vision in high conflict, and listening helps us get it back. So a year later, after doing all this training, building all these guardrails, setting up rules of engagement, developing a culture that leaned into conflict instead of away, another conflict flared up in the synagogue. This one about interfaith marriage. Should they do it? Should they not? But they knew what to do. They just leaned into it again. And it was amazing because this time it felt much easier, less like a battle and more like an inquiry, more like an investigation, like a mystery. And the rabbis ultimately decided to do interfaith marriages with certain conditions. There were people in the synagogue to this day who think that was a terrible mistake, but no one left because they understood each other even as they disagreed. Then the ultimate test for the synagogue came in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president. And almost no one in the synagogue had voted for Donald Trump. And they had very strong feelings about this. And it felt like an earthquake again. But this time they didn't know anyone that they could lean into conflict with, right? They felt like, as Martha Acklesberg, one of the congregants, told me, they were all stereotypes to me. I didn't have anyone I could talk to. Now, granted, she could have gotten on the subway and gone to Long Island or Queens and talked to some people, but that's not how it works, right? In modern America, we are very politically segregated. So 2 years went by, and they weren't sure what to do. But then, through a series of strange events, an organizer, a labor organizer who had ties to the synagogue named Simon Greer, he proposed to the rabbis that they do a 3-day homestay cultural exchange with a group of conservative Trump-supporting Christians in Michigan so that they could lean into the conflict. These were people Simon knew from his labor organizing work, and they were all corrections officers in the prison system in Michigan. And most of them had never met a Jew. So he took this idea to both sides. Both sides laughed, thought it was hilarious. And then he took it back, and he took it back, and he took it back. And finally, Rabbi Rowley had to admit that Simon had a point. Probably if they were going to lean into conflict, they should do this. They should do this. As you might imagine, both sides had a lot of grave concerns about this idea. And as a reporter who was fortunate enough to go along on the exchange, I will tell you how strange it was to talk to both of them in advance and hear the same words. Both sides were frightened of each other. The folks in Michigan felt like they were crazy for opening up their homes where their kids lived to a bunch of strange lefty Jewish New Yorkers. Literally, these people may or may not be part of Antifa. I'm not joking, that was the feeling. And then for the New Yorkers' part, they felt like this is crazy. Some of them couldn't sleep. They felt like maybe they would get physically hurt. Certainly they would face some kind of bigotry. They would be somehow complicit. So the New Yorkers on the left expected hatred and bigotry and ignorance. The Michigan folks on the right expected condescension, dismissal, attacks. And I had to think, how did this happen? These are two people who speak the same language and live in the same time zone. And I actually think it would have been easier for them to open up their homes to people from a faraway country. Who does that serve? But they did it. They couldn't sleep the night before. There was a lot of trepidation, but they did it. They went, first of all, to a firing range in Michigan, as one does. They went to a prison museum. They had lunch. They had Superman-flavored ice cream. Has anyone had this, like a Midwest thing? All right. I had never had it before. I was excited. They had a lot of hard conversations. They didn't avoid the conflict. They talked about Trump. They talked about race. They talked about religion. They talked about guns. They talked about abortion. They talked about immigration. And it was so interesting because, first of all, they had some ground rules, which is what we're missing, right, on social media and in politics right now. Not that hard, actually. Every kindergarten class has them. So we could have them. In this case, the ground rules that they agreed to, not that they were imposed on them, that's important, were we're going to stay curious, we're not going to try to convince each other, and we're going to respect what each other holds dear. Now, it's important to note that, like all ground rules, they totally violated all of them, right? But then you're reminded of the ground rules and you come back. That's how ground rules work, right? So one of the things that happened is they realized there was a lot of confusion about the facts. They had totally different sets of facts, which is a big and foundational problem that I think my profession has to own. What they also found is that there were a certain portion of things that they just had totally misunderstood about each other. For example, the conservatives thought that the liberals wanted no borders. Not the case. They also thought the liberals wanted to take away all their guns. I don't know how many times I heard people say, I don't want to take away all your guns. It took a while to convince people, right? And you know, the liberals thought the conservatives didn't care about poor people. The liberals thought the conservatives were white supremacists. Many of them still think that. But this weird thing happened where they, in the middle of all of this, so remember, they're staying in each other's homes, which I think is important, because there's something about hospitality. There's something about breaking bread together that opens people up. In the middle of all of this, Mindy Vroman, one of the corrections officers from Michigan, she pulled me aside and she said, you know, it's so weird, but I'm starting to actually like these people. So they were able to stridently disagree and still delight in each other's company, which was a new feeling for everyone. Martha, the B'nai Jeshurun synagogue member I mentioned earlier, she said to me, I felt like on those 3 days, I was the person I wanted to be. I was open. I was curious. I was able to be surprised. This is, by the way, a picture of Rabbi Rowley and Caleb Follett, who's also one of the Michigan corrections officers, many of these guys had never been to New York before. So after the Michigan exchange program, they came to New York, stayed in the New Yorkers' apartments. They went to synagogue services together. They went to Ground Zero. They had hard conversations. A group of the New Yorkers actually agreed very begrudgingly to take a group of the Michigan folks to Trump Tower so they could go to the gift shop. It was a very strange experience. And you know what? It was kind of awesome because I had come from Washington, D.C., where I live, to watch these 24 Americans go against everything in our culture to try to know each other and still profoundly disagree, to do what Congress cannot. And it was an incredible thing to sort of behold. So I mentioned earlier that in high conflict, any intuitive thing you do won't work, right? It'll probably backfire. So then you have to do counterintuitive things. And these are some of the things that the synagogue and the folks in Michigan did. They listened. They blurred the fixed groups that they had in their own mind and out loud, right? They stopped seeing everybody as neatly sorted into camps. And they investigated the understory. This is the thing the conflict is really about, right? John and Julie Gottman, who study marital conflict, they have tried to make a list of all the things couples are fighting about when they're fighting about money. And they got to 100 and they stopped because it was just going to go on forever. And then I want to leave you with this image. Does anyone know what this is? This is Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, located where the Crocker Mansion once stood. The Crocker ancestors donated the land after the earthquake and the fire and the spite fence. So I want to leave you with this image because, like all exceptional human accomplishments, it was built in good conflict. If you don't think there's conflict in building a cathedral, you have not built a cathedral. There's good conflict, but like everything amazing humans have done, it made everyone stronger because it wasn't high conflict. We are wired for both of these things, the cathedral and the spite fence. We have to design our institutions and our cultures for good conflict, not high conflict. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you today.
Please welcome Dr. Stephanie Sanford, Chief of Global Policy and External Relations at the College Board.
So that was amazing. You and I have been having these conversations for years, and it's just, I'm just amazed at how insightful and timely this book is. So thank you for that. I think the sign of a great insight is, and I think you said this in your talk, you see it, once you know it, you see it everywhere.
You can't unsee it.
You can't, you can't unsee it. And so we have a few minutes here, and I really want to, you've been so helpful to me, and I really want to sort of explore your advice to sets of people who are here in the audience: policymakers, institutions, and parents. And so you sort of alluded to it. I mean, to the policymakers who are here, this binary is sort of a two-party system, but it's what we've got. So, I mean, what's your advice to policymakers who get out of high conflict and into good conflict? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, some changes have to be like at a high level and they're going to take time. But I mean, one small change that I'm actually excited about, I'm curious what other people think, is the rise in ranked choice voting. This is a small thing that is happening in Maine and Alaska and New York City that, again, breaks the binary because you get to choose your top 4 or 5 candidates instead of just one. So it isn't this sense of your group has totally lost if your first guy doesn't win. So there are different reforms like this, like proportional representation, other things. Okay, but then on the institutional level, for most people in their day-to-day life, what I see that's really cool, the other day I got to sit in on an all-hands meeting at a pretty large company that has its share of conflict, like most companies right now. And the CEO did something really cool, which is he started the meeting by acknowledging all the different opinions that he had heard from his employees. So there weren't two, right? There were some people who felt like they weren't doing enough on racial justice. And then there were other people who felt this. And then there was a third group who wasn't sure what to think. Rabbi Rowley does this too now, by the way. So you start by priming people for complexity. But what you're also doing, in addition to breaking that binary, is you're showing people you've heard them, right? Like the CEO has actually listened to all these people and taken it in, and he's playing it back for them, right? So that's a way that you can, I mean, you have to listen. Is the problem. You have to actually listen. But then you can prime people for curiosity. And there's a lot of research that says you can. Like if people walk into a room and it's going to be a difficult conversation and you acknowledge all the complexity in the room, and it's not just two fixed groups, that most of us, if you ask the question a different way, will give you a different answer on hard problems because they're complicated. That can help open people up a little bit to curiosity.
And do you see in policymakers and levels of institution sort of national versus state versus more local? And do you think, is it easier or harder at those different levels?
Well, we would have said it would be easier at local level, right?
Right, yeah.
Certainly there's still more trust at the local level, don't you think? So there's more opportunity there. I think the most exciting changes in journalism are happening at the local level because it's the only place where there's any trust. And that's mostly because, if the stoplight is out on Main Street, you can see it with your own eyes, right? You can verify. So I think it's still better at the local level, but it's certainly trickled down from the national level. So I think the changes and improvements are going to happen at every level. I don't know, what do you think?
You have relationship would seem to be easier at a local level. But you certainly seem to have, more professional conflict entrepreneurs. By the way, I love the creation of your new terminology, as Chris talked about. You gave us all a vocabulary then to name some of the things that we see here. And so obviously we're coming out of a pandemic, I hope. And in your book, you talk about, you sort of hoped here was this great sort of common enemy.
Right.
And that would be a real opening. That would unify us. Yeah, what do you make of that?
It's so funny because when you would interview polarization researchers for years and years, they would joke, oh, wouldn't it be great if there was an invasion of space aliens? That would be perfect because then we would have a common enemy. And all the research shows that if you have a common enemy, it does band people together. And I think you saw that at first with the pandemic. There's usually a golden hour in every disaster where there is a really powerful, poignant sense of solidarity between strangers and between neighbors. But it requires some trust for that to last, and it requires leaders who are skilled and interested in that lasting. So unfortunately, that was a lost opportunity on the one hand. On the other hand, I think the duration of this particular disaster is such that no leader could have kept us together. We could have been together much longer. Particularly if we had more trust going into it, right? Like when I used to cover disasters, the most heartbreaking lesson over and over again was it's the health of a community going into the disaster that predicts the recovery afterward. It's sometimes more important than the actual disaster, right? It's were these institutions sick? Were they corrupt? Were they distrusted before the hurricane or whatever? And if that's the case, it's much, much harder.
Well, I think we have a lot of institutional leaders here, and everybody has sort of their pandemic story, and that moment. And certainly at the College Board, we did at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, here we are, a 100-year-old nonprofit. We've been, doing college access for 100 years. We know advanced coursework, and boom, everything shuts down in March, and we're faced with this huge and potentially controversial decision, which is, do we cancel AP exams? And so we went out and we used our capabilities and we said, we asked students, 91% of them said, yep, we want to test, we want to have our shot at college credit.
I didn't know it was that high. Wow.
91% of students said that. And so that meant then we had to move millions of AP exams online in 7 weeks.
There was no online option before this? Oh, wow.
And so that forced this traditional institution to work in all kinds of new ways in our pandemic moment.
Right.
It really, we worked in totally new ways. So we surveyed parents, we tried to figure out, and that brought us face to face with the digital divide, which is one of the big sort of problems that we now see a potential to solve.
Yeah.
And we had over 100 of our staff manned helplines to be able to talk to families and figure out like what kind of devices do they need. We really surveyed, and it like brought us together. And then we ended up partnering with folks who are here, with the Walton Foundation, with Google, with Amazon, and we delivered thousands of devices to students. And it was just this real triumph.
You felt
We felt that
camaraderie.
and yet it wasn't perfect, and it was sort of covered as a conflict. Right, it was the sort of the glitch, right? The glitch narrative.
Right.
And yet we found this sense of capabilities, and we really want to be able to sustain that and bring it to bear on some of the problems that we're seeing here. And your insights have been so influential. So we're trying to coalesce now those capabilities into the College Board Foundation, and really sort of live your insights about listening to our constituents in new ways, really bringing concrete capabilities to bear, and solving some of the problems now that have been made more acute by this pandemic. We've talked about them here. We should fix the digital divide now, and we can, right? Can we improve access to good jobs? Can we improve the functioning of our democracies? And so what advice do you have now to institutions and mission-driven organizations that really want to transcend this pandemic moment?
Yeah.
And really solve real concrete problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I think about what I've learned from Rabbi Rowley, from Gary, from Curtis, from Sandra, the first thing would be you have to repair trust. And that requires really listening to people. A lot of people are asking me, what are we going to do? It's Thanksgiving. We're going to fight. What's going to happen? Are there 10 tips? And I'm like, well, there are lots of things we could talk about, but this is probably a time for repair. This is probably a time for you to make sure that you are hearing each other, that you lean into hard conversations, right? Like the synagogue did, that you develop really good new rules and rituals about how we're going to treat each other in conflict, and do those things together. Like, don't impose them on people, but ask them, what do you think the rules should be? Because they're going to be different than they were. They should be different than they were, But is there a way we can speak our truths and still treat each other with dignity, and not dehumanize each other? So do you have role models? We had a great discussion at lunch yesterday and about sort of modeling civil and civic behavior. Yeah,
and they talked about, do we have saints?
Right.
Do we have saints? Do you have people that you look to that are real and examples that we can,
I mean, all the people I've told you about today, and I literally call up Gary, the conflict expert who ran for office, and I will sometimes play him tapes, like recordings of interviews I've done that I felt like could have gone better, and he'll give me feedback, And I'm always trying to channel Curtis, I met with members of Congress about polarization, and before I went, I talked to Curtis, because these are people who have been through it, and they know that it is possible to get to the other side. But I'll tell you what Curtis and his colleagues spend most of their time doing now in Chicago, which has become a very violent place, is they help feuding gang members establish non-aggression pacts, rules of engagement. Same thing we've been talking about. Same thing that the Michigan and New Yorkers did when they set up those 3 rules. And usually the rules are all about what they're going to post on social media, because about 75% of gang violence today starts on social media. Wow. So in some tragic ways, These gang violence interrupters are way ahead of us when it comes to understanding our high conflict in politics. And the behavior is not that different. Like, the difference is access to weapons and the trauma level of the people involved and the age of the people involved. But the behavior is not that different. So what I told these members of Congress, and what I keep saying to anyone who'll listen, is, we should have a non-aggression pact for our politicians, right? Like, what are the things you're gonna commit to? In the case of the gangs, we're not gonna humiliate each other on social media. We're not gonna disrespect and disparage people who have been shot and killed in rival gangs, because that's what leads to the violence. So it's gonna be different maybe for
politicians.
But you wait long enough and it'll look the same.
So implicit, you and I have had a conversation about the reciprocity norms, right?
Yeah.
So, which is to respond in kind.
Yeah.
And so if a conflict entrepreneur, if someone disrespects you, your impulse is to disrespect back.
Right.
I want to ask you the question that I asked you in our last conversation. Who goes first?
Right, it's a game
Right?
of chicken.
It's a game of chicken, right? Because as you think about how you pivot from high conflict to productive conflict and good conflict, which then is, animates our policy world and democracy and how, it's about our system. What's your advice? Who goes first? If an institution or an individual here wants to try to flip the switch from high conflict to good conflict and problem solving, who goes first?
Yeah, this requires a lot of practice. But the first thing that I have learned from people, let's take Gary in politics. When he realized that he had sort of hit bottom, right? He hit his saturation point, and that he didn't want to go out this way, he did small things to rehumanize himself and his opponents. He made slightly different choices. He stepped out of the dance of high conflict. So there was a point when some of his political opponents had made a procedural mistake that he felt like was a big deal. And so his first instinct was to call a public meeting. But he knew that that was a form of humiliation. And it would just be a gotcha exercise that would mostly make him feel good, but not lead to lasting change. So he didn't do that. They resolved it without humiliation. So that takes a level of awareness and self-control. But I was talking to a superintendent from California who's really, just miserably buried in conflicts because of the pandemic. And I brought him together with Gary, actually, for a podcast conversation about what he could do. And one of the things that Gary said is, I can feel the pain in your voice, said this to the superintendent. I can feel this has been really hard for you. Have you shown that to the teachers union or to the parents? And he said, oh, no, I feel like this is my job. I get paid for, that whole. And Gary said, okay, I hear that. But, if you don't humanize yourself, no one will. And you make yourself a target of convenience in a time of great anxiety and suffering when you act like a robot and you act like you're the authority figure, you're the big daddy, you've got it all figured out. And again, it's totally counterintuitive to be vulnerable in front of the teachers union president. It was not something the superintendent wanted to hear, but Gary encouraged him to practice it with another superintendent he trusts, to have that conversation where you don't put everything out there, but you reveal a little bit, and then it becomes harder for other people to dehumanize you.
So then you turn that vicious cycle into a virtuous one.
It interrupts it. There's a famous story about Nelson Mandela meeting with a general, and there was a lot of violence, and the general was incredibly overtly racist and came to Nelson Mandela's office, and Nelson Mandela offered him some tea, and he said, sure, and Nelson Mandela went and got it himself. The general was like, Nelson Mandela had staff, so he could have had someone else do that. And then he spoke to the general in Afrikaans. So this is something Nelson Mandela had learned in prison on purpose. And to this day, that is a very controversial thing that he did. A lot of people didn't like it. It seemed like he was pandering or putting himself subordinate to this guy. And you know what? He walked out of there with a deal. So that's reciprocity. You interrupt the dance. And it may not work, it may not solve the problem, but it disrupts. There's a moment where the plates are kind of spinning in the air.
Well, your ability to turn these stories into lessons that get us out of combat, I think is really one of your superpowers. In one of our last conversations, you gave us a term for that called solutions journalism.
Oh yeah.
And and part of our foundation is a magazine called The Elective, which we interviewed you for, and we didn't know that was what it was called.
Right. I didn't either. Yeah.
Yeah, and so. So how is it that we can better tell these kinds of stories and elevate them and increase the appetite for this solutions journalism?
Look, I just feel like I really think there's a huge unmet demand in this country for a different kind of journalism, for a different kind of politics that is not so exhausting, that is not so depressing, but still true, right? So there's this great nonprofit based in New York City called the Solutions Journalism Network. And again, I didn't know that was a thing, but I knew I would just, on my own, try to write stories about people trying to solve problems, even if they failed, because it's just more interesting, right? And I think I just needed some hope, as we all do, right? But they have really got some good traction going. And the coolest thing, I'll just tell you really quickly, is they did a really good big study. And they had people, regular American audiences, watch 2 different TV news segments side by side. One was about a problem, and one was about a community trying to solve that problem, right? And they found that engagement was more than twice as high with the solution story, and it cut across race, political affiliation, age, gender, everything, which is really unusual. Like you don't see that. And I actually think that's kind of a new thing, but if we can build on that, local TV news in particular is interested in engagement. And if you can prove to them that different kinds of stories will keep their audiences watching, they will change what they do eventually.
Well, I mean, certainly you have a group of people here and leaders here that are interested in finding solutions to problems. So one last question to get down to a little bit more personal. You alluded to you're a mom, you have teenagers at home, and we've got a lot of parents in the audience. What lessons do you have from high conflict to parents in the room?
You know, it's funny because it was a lot easier when you would ask me these questions about education. That was like how to find us good school and what should you, and this is a hard one. And I think the thing that has totally transformed how I parent is this active listening stuff. I mean, I actually think it's a great way to practice deeper listening. Does anyone have kids at home right now? Okay, so maybe it's just me, but in my experience, they're always bringing you some kind of grievance, right? Like there's a lot of conflict, just part of parenting. So it's really a great way in a low stakes environment to practice a different kind of conflict. Because if you are living in our culture and have grown up in our culture, you're not going to be able to change these behaviors overnight, especially under stress, right? So you don't want to practice these, in a high stakes conflict. You want to practice them again and again and again with your kids. So just to take an example, I have a 14-year-old son, and he'll come to me. I'll say to him, "You got to go upstairs and shower," right? And he'll say, come on, like every night, as if we haven't had this conversation. "Oh, come on, like Quinn doesn't shower and I shouldn't have to shower. I didn't sweat today. I didn't do that. I just went to the," and it's really tempting. My instinct, right, is to be like, "Go upstairs," right? Or even worse, to be like, "I actually don't care what Quinn has to do. This is our house, and when you're in our house," or like try to argue the facts, right? "And you did sweat today, and by the way," and that's madness, right? Like there's no end. He'll happily do that for 4 or 5 hours. I mean, so now I say, I listen. I actually have to listen. Not easy, because I think I know what he's going to say. I actually have to listen for just like 15 seconds, not that long, and then I'll literally try to distill his argument. I'll be like, "You know what? You just feel like this is a waste of your time. You got things you want to do. You have only so much time before lights out, and this is like absurd. Like this is a convention without any rational reason behind it. Is that right?" And he'll be like, "Yeah, exactly," which is what people always say when you correctly loop them through active listening. They say, "Exactly." And if they don't say exactly, that means you didn't get it and you gotta try it again. But, and then you know what happens? He goes and takes a shower. It's like a miracle every time. So I strongly recommend trying this at home because there's a lot of conflict at home, right? And it's probably the place that matters most when we are trying to get better at conflict. And it will bring you to your knees, right? But I think practicing it in that way has been really helpful for me. And then when sudden conflict breaks out in real life, not real life, but outside of a low stakes environment, I can do that automatically now, which, you know, I was giving a talk. It was a friendly, I thought, about a story I'd written that was very positive about this town. And somebody in the back, you know, raised his hand, a group of young people, and they just started laying into me. You know, they were just like, you got it wrong, you're a terrible journalist, all this stuff, like just personal attacks. I didn't see it coming, which we know from the research is actually the worst. Like when you feel disrespected and you didn't expect to be, you react even more aggressively. That's your instinct, right? For good evolutionary reasons, less helpful today. So I didn't have to think. I couldn't think. I was so shocked and kind of embarrassed and like, I couldn't think. So I just looped him. I just did the act of listening. I was like, wow, you feel like I really got this wrong. I didn't talk to the right people and I did your town an injustice, a disservice. You didn't recognize your town in that story. That must have felt awful. And it was just like his whole face changed. Like his shoulders came down. I mean, we still disagreed. It's not like we changed each other's minds, but now he could listen because he'd been hurt.
So it's really an astonishing framework. I mean, the notion of high conflict and how you get out of it, and the tools that you bring and the behaviors that you bring that's applicable to, you know, geopolitical conflict, to policymakers, to institutions, to educations, to trying to get a 14-year-old to shop.
I know.
That is
I don't think they're different. I don't think they're different. I actually don't think, I'm always telling my friends who cover politics, I'm like, why do you not have a psychologist on staff? Like, what are you guys even doing? Like, if I have to listen to you one more time on this, you know, show, try to game out why, you know, Mitch McConnell is doing this and what they're trying to, and the strategy. I'm like, oh my God, shut up. Like it's a 14-year-old who needs to shower. Like it's not different, you know?
I think that may be our new metaphor for conflict and politics in America. So congratulations on the success of the book. And thank you for your advice to us. And I hope we hear much, much more of you as we're trying to navigate coming out of the pandemic. It's a massive contribution to our discourse and to our democracy. And so please join me in thanking Amanda Ripley.
Thank you.